It's great to be here. You know, one of these days we'll be able to do these things in person, but for now, this is good too. Yeah, today I'm just going to talk about GitHub open source and DevOps. I started at Microsoft about 8 years ago, and actually 9 years ago. They asked me to help with Java, which back then was an interesting journey. There was all kinds of things that that affected our Java. There really wasn't any Java at Microsoft, and there was a lot of. I'm sure everyone's heard the quotes and things of previous CEOs and prominent people at Microsoft who talked about open source in maybe a little bit of a suspicious way, but you know, we've seen things change at Microsoft since then. And yeah, we've moved on, and we're really, you know, a lot of people consider us to be one of the leading forces in how to implement open source in a large organization. And yeah, I got to hand it to the Microsoft leaders and everyone who helped with the transition as well. When I joined, it was all about boxes on shelves at Best Buy, right? We were selling boxes on shelves at Best Buy, and now it's all about services and about quick delivery and making that transition without completely cannibalizing our existing business was not easy. And I got to hand it to the leaders who made that transition, and they did it well. But this is a great quote from Satya Nadella, the current CEO. Tech companies are born with who are born with an open source mentality get it. You know, the ability to make to work together is really the thing that you have to do with open source and build on the ideas of others. And you know, this isn't just Microsoft's idea. Of course, you know, the reason why Microsoft is so interested in open source is most of our customers are asking for open source solutions and ways to handle their open source internally as well. 96% of today's applications use open source software. 80 to 90% of code in new applications come from open source. So, and these stats are old. It's probably even higher now. But you know, open source on Azure has got a lot of interesting things. Ron mentioned Linux on Azure. It's definitely the fastest growing platform we have. And we have endeavored to work with partners and communities to make sure that things are flexible and open source that we have. And one of these stats that I like to talk about all the time is that 50%, more than 50% of our VM cores are now Linux, which is pretty cool. And a lot of the Azure Marketplace images we have are Linux-based as well. You know, Windows is still around. Windows is there. It's used in a ton of big enterprises. But a lot of our customers are running Linux or have been running Linux for years, and you know, we're helping them. And here's a good example of one of them. So Daimler, you know, I work personally in the Java team as a cloud advocate at Microsoft, and Daimler is one of our large Java customers, and they brought Java, Tomcat, Docker, Red Hat, SUSE, just tons of open source technologies, and we put it all in Azure. And they run everything reliably and profitably as well, because they're saving a lot of money over there on-prem stuff. So here's some other customers you've seen out there. I won't belabor this or call them all out, but basically all these customers use Linux, open source, Kubernetes, or other open source technologies on Microsoft as well. So how does Microsoft do open source? This is one of the things that we get asked. Yeah, okay, so you know, open source is profitable and your customers want it, so you're doing it, but how do we actually do it internally? And we do. We actually have some interesting developments and offerings out there. I urge everyone out there to have a look at the Microsoft GitHub. Just search GitHub Microsoft, and there's a ton of stuff out there. And here's some examples, actually. So here's a timeline. If you look at this, you know, Windows installer was on, remember SourceForge, remember CodePlex. These are places where we used to put our open source applications, and internally we actually had some going back and forth. And then in 2012 is when MS OpenText launched and Brian joined Microsoft. And of course, at that time, so it's interesting to see this. By the way, 2001 to 2012, the stock was running about $24 a share, and now it's $340 a share. So as of today. So that's a pretty good growth. I think I'd like to take credit for that personally, but I like to think I at least contributed a little. But anyway, I digress. In 2012, we started MS Open Tech, which was a group that was to encourage Microsoft internally to adopt open source. And before then, they had some efforts that they had done, but they've been scattered and legal was very involved at Microsoft in terms of open source back then. And since then, we worked internally with legal, we worked externally with communities, and we delivered a whole bunch of stuff. And one of the notable developments that we have is Visual Studio Code. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit as well. Here's one. 2018, MS-DOS was available on GitHub. So it's something I like to do at presentations. I ask a trick question. How many people think that open source, that MS-DOS now should be open source? And everybody puts their hand up, and I go, it's been open source since 2018. So that's the kind of thing that you can find if you go on the Microsoft GitHub. You'll see this kind of stuff out there. We have 10,000 plus repos on GitHub these days. So not only do we have open source that we're using and providing to customers through services, but we actually contribute back to open source as well. And here's just some of the examples of the contributions that Microsoft has made to open source. With Linux, we've provided a ton of code back to the Linux Foundation for that. Cloud Native Computing Foundation, we are very involved with Dapper and Kita and several other projects which we work with. Brendan Burns, one of the co-creators of Kubernetes, works at Microsoft and makes sure that we contribute back when we develop cool stuff. Also Data and AI, when it comes to Hadoop and Spark, Yarn, Postgres, tons of things there. We also contribute back to specific languages with Java. We actually have our own version of the OpenJDK now as well. And tons of offerings that we've had actually since a long time on the web, Webpack and a few other things that we've been providing back to those projects and those communities as well. So we give back as well. Who manages this at Microsoft is this group called the Open Source Programs Office. And internally, they tell us things like, how do you actually, ethically provide open source and make sure that you're not exposing anything legally to the communities and to your company as well. And this is, you can find general information on how to do that at opensource.microsoft.com in the Open Source Programs Office. There's a lot of cool things in there too. For example, these days when you're working with communities and when you're working with events, one of the things you need is a code of conduct. And if you go to that open source, you can actually find an open source code of conduct that Microsoft uses for their own events, and you can adopt it for yours as well. So that's the example of the kind of cool stuff you can find at the Open Source Program Office. And the Open Source Programs Office manages open source software policy for Microsoft, and that includes using, contributing, and releasing. And there's a lot more details at opensource.microsoft.com. We also work with prime organizations, those who are, I'm putting my fingers up in quotes here, corporate custodians of large communities of software, and that's, Canonical, all the companies you see here. I constantly work with the folks at Spring and Red Hat myself, and we're doing some good things with Docker and Canonical as well. Always working with folks in the community to make sure that we're working with engineering, operations, and support. And we also belong to a ton of foundations. I personally participate in the Apache Foundation, Eclipse, and some others as well that we work with to make sure that everything is, when we're building open source, we're actually contributing back as well. I mentioned before Visual Studio Code. So Visual Studio Code is a text editor. It's open source. If you go just search for GitHub VS Code, all one word, you'll find the VS Code repo there, and you can download it. You can edit the code if you want, and you can provide issues. I know personally that they work with issues, and we use our internal DevOps systems, including Actions, which I'm going to show you a little bit. GitHub Actions for building these things as well. We also have open data sets. People don't know about these. You're probably familiar with Kaggle. If you're not, check them out. They're owned by Google, but they have a ton of open source data sets that you can use that are public domain. And we also at Microsoft publish our own open source data sets as well for some of the things you've got here. If you follow through, if you just search on Microsoft historical weather, you'll find details on downloading that. We've also got things like public holidays and stuff like that that you can use for your own applications. So check those out. If you're building apps, there's a ton of stuff that you can use and integrate with your applications that we provide for free and open source. And that brings me to GitHub. So GitHub, we bought, as you saw in that timeline, we bought it in, gosh, what was it, 2018. And we, before that, we were the largest contribution to GitHub repos. I used to use that stat a lot. There's this report you can check out called the State of the Octoverse. I think it's still at 2021, but you can go in there. There's a ton of really, really interesting information. If you want to know about open source info in general, there's two sources that I use. The State of the Octoverse, so you can just search on that, and you'll find it. It tells you what's in GitHub repos, what's being used, what are the most active repos out there. Also, there's a Stack Overflow survey of people from all over the world. Both of these things come out every year, and they publish info. But yeah, before we bought GitHub, we were actually the biggest contributors to GitHub as well. And here's something from back in 2018 when we did the purchase. One of the things that GitHub does is drive the agility of your development. Yeah, GitHub is a way of life. I don't know. It is an incredibly useful tool for collaboration. If you're speaking code, it's really something that's useful for you. 50 million plus developers, 140 million private and public repos, and we've done some cool stuff, by the way. Everyone, not everyone, but a lot of people in the press were saying, oh my God, Microsoft bought GitHub, they're going to ruin it. And a lot of folks moved to competitors and stuff. And yeah, it turns out most of those are back now because we actually provided a lot of things that GitHub used to charge for free now. So for example, private repos where there was a charge for those, especially if you have a large group. Now we have free private repos for teams and for groups. So check that out if you missed that news. It was a couple of years ago now, but still I find people who weren't aware that we actually opened up a lot of things that you used to have to pay for on GitHub that are now free. So check out what's free these days. Yeah, so what does GitHub offer? For those of you who might not have heard of it, I guess pretty much everyone's heard of it by now. I'm taking that for granted, but collaboration, security, and DevOps. And I'm going to talk a little bit about DevOps here as well. How are we doing for time? Oh, we're doing okay. So, when you're talking about GitHub and DevOps, they have GitHub Actions. We also integrate with Azure pipelines, which is a way to do some really cool multi-stage pipelines as well. They're a little more complicated than what GitHub has. GitHub is slowly implementing a lot of the features that were in Azure pipelines, but they don't have as robust an offering as Azure Pipelines does at the moment. So check out Azure Pipelines as well. But basically, for GitHub Actions, there's tons of support for CICD through our marketplace. And also in the marketplace, you can find deployments for Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, all the prominent platforms. It's a marketplace where third parties can provide action scripts and things are done from there. So what am I talking about when I talk about Actions? There are marketplace images you can get. So if you just search for GitHub Actions Marketplace, you'll find a ton of different actions which you can start with. But basically, they're YAML files, and you can trigger them with certain actions that happen on your repo. So if you push something to a repo, or there's a pull request sent to a repo, you can trigger an action. And these actions run on what we call runners, which are basically servers at GitHub that process those scripts. And you can do things like testing, you can do builds. They have a ton of software pre-built into the runners, or you can add your own custom software in. You can also use local runners. So if you have something that needs to be done locally, For security or compliance reasons, you have local runners too that can be used for building and deploying your applications. But the key is the actions can run on their servers or your servers. They build, they deploy, and they integrate with a lot of different third-party applications. And we also have something called packages, which doesn't get as much press, which is a package manager for GitHub. So if you have NPM or Maven or those others, they have a way of managing those packages, which quite often organizations need for auditing and source control. Now, I actually already talked about this, but the CICD is integrated with GitHub. It's automated, and you can use your preferred languages. And when you're working with those GitHub hosted runners I mentioned, when it's Windows, Linux, and Mac are supported, and there are also self-hosted runners with x86 and ARM, including Windows, Linux, and Mac, of course, as well. Some of the other cool stuff that happens on GitHub, you can have built-in governance and traceability. I know this from Microsoft has their own infrastructure when you're pushing things to GitHub that's been customized, and other companies can do this as well, where they do checks and make sure that there's a minimum amount of compliance before we push to a public repo. And you can use best practices, and you can have unified authentication with Azure AD, which is used in 80% of the Fortune 500 companies. Also, if you have your own authentication systems, there is probably an authentication method that you can use for identity management inside your organization that links to GitHub. So you don't have to have a separate GitHub login and authentication for going back and forth with your code locally and on GitHub. There is also, because GitHub is just so big and has so many folks, there are just so many actions already pre-built. So there's probably an action out there that you can at least use and edit as a starting point, maybe a template to deliver your own solutions that you're building with GitHub Actions as well. Also, there's code scanning. So this is one of the banes of my existence when I'm posting things to GitHub. If I'm a little bit sloppy with my code, or I don't have a readability of my markdown files, Microsoft has built in a whole bunch of things that actually check that and feed back to you and won't let you merge something until you do. So you can integrate all this and you can build it. I know from experience it's very effective and can be useful as well. It's very, very useful actually. A lot of people don't know about GitHub Mobile. So you can use GitHub Mobile to edit code and push things. There is also an app for Azure. So search for the Azure app as well. Inside the Azure app, there's a command line interface. So you can do what's called a Cloud Shell, and you can actually put Azure CLI commands in there, and you could actually manipulate and run infrastructure on your cloud from your phone, which is kind of nice. A while ago, I took a vacation. I didn't have my laptop, and I had to shut down some Kubernetes clusters that I had, and I used the mobile solution for that. But GitHub Mobile as well is pretty cool because you can work on code, and you can actually manage pull requests and things like that too. Last but not least, code spaces. So code spaces is basically something that folks have been asking for a long time. What if we could just take a GitHub repo, and when you push a button, it would create a development environment online that used that repo and worked with it? Now, we have code spaces to do that. Code spaces is pretty cool because it actually doesn't work directly on the repo. It starts up a container, and then it takes a clone of your repo, and you work on that locally. And that means that other people can also have their own code spaces and working on their version of that as well. And you push things back to your repo just like you would if you were working locally. But the advantage is you could be anywhere. So you could actually fire up code spaces on that dodgy computer in the hotel lobby or wherever you are. If you don't have an environment set up on your machine that you're working with at that moment, you can also predefine workspaces that are used in code space. So if you have a minimum requirement for Node or Java or any other standard packages that you're using when you're working with this particular repo, you can create a standardized code space that everyone has to use, and that will sort of enforce some compliance and security right into your development environments as well.